Greetings. Hello, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to reading Locke's Second Treatise of Government. Today we're doing chapter 4, which is on slavery. On slavery is kind of a short chapter. Um, um, it only has three sections, sections 22, 23, 24. Um, it is it follows from the state of war, right? And the state of war was that the situation of people having power or absolute power over another, right? Um, and this now talks about and that having absolute power over another was the definition of almost a kind of definition of slavery in the previous chapter. So now he deals with the question of slavery. The natural liberty of man is to be born free from any superior power on earth, and not to be under the will or legitimate or legislative authority of man, but to have only the law of nature for his rule. So therefore, that the natural liberty man is not to be under someone's command, not to be under the power of anyone, and to only be under the laws of nature. Now, what is the law of nature? Is it the law of nature here referring to moral law? Because this is one idea of the natural, this idea of the moral law, the natural law, where that there's a principle of morals and there's, or just the laws of nature are just simply the physical laws of the reality. In other words, there's two possibilities here, and Locke wants to play between it. That way, he can, by saying this, he can appeal to those who uphold a kind of Christian natural law position and say, "Oh, I'm one of you," and then at the same time talk about the language as kind of this kind of Baconian, Hobbesian kind of new science. So let's continue. Second sentence. The liberty of man in society is to be under no other no, in other words, a man in society is to be under no other legislative power but that established by consent in the Commonwealth, nor under the dominion of any will or restraint of any law but what the legislature shall enact, according to the trust put in that. So therefore, in society, people should no one should be under any law or under any power other than the such laws and authority that a rightfully construed by consent legislative power has legally and rightfully authorized, right? So, and this is that what legitimizes legitimate power is that it's consent. And this is the Commonwealth, right? And nor under the dominion of any will or restraint of any law, but that of the legislative, which shall enact. And accordingly, to put trust in. That's the first sentence. Freedom, then, is not what Sir Robert Filmer tells us. Observation 55. A liberty for everyone to do what he lists, to live as he pleases, and not to be tied by any laws. But freedom of men under government is to have a standing rule to live by, common to everyone of that society, and made by the legislative power erected in it. A liberty to follow my own will in all things, where the rule prescribes not, and not to be subjected to the inconstant, uncertain, and unknown arbitrary will of another man, as the freedom of nature is to be under no rule, no other restraint, but the law of nature. So therefore, in other words, this is interesting. In other words, he's criticizing Filmer of freedom because Filmer argues in a sense that freedom is to do what you want, right? To live as you please. Okay. But that is, this is something that even Aristotle would hold you that listen, this is because, this is, and Montesquieu himself would later talk about this. There's different society, different type of political systems will define freedom differently. Montesquieu makes a big fuss with it, saying For the Russians, the Muscovites, freedom meant having the right to have long beards. Okay, some people freedom would be to not be under authority of others. Others is to do what you will. In fact, Plato and Aristotle, more Plato would argue that the democratic freedom of the democratic society of the egal is to do what you please. Okay, but this, and therefore that's why it's kind of akin to tyranny in that sense. So Filmer is kind of quoting Plato here. Locke is therefore denying Plato in that sense. But now this is a problem now, because what he does here is that okay, but notice this natural freedom. What is natural freedom? Because I mean, in many sense, Filmer is not wrong to argue that in a democracy, in a liberal democracy, freedom means to whatever we want to do with it, right? Isn't this the liberal position? It's my body and I can do with it. I can do what I want with it. This is the argument for abortion. This is the argument of transgenderism and all this other things. That this is it's my life, myself, and I can do what I want with it, and no one can tell me otherwise. Now Locke seems to be saying, well, no, mister. It's not doing what you want. Because again, remember, he said that this is liberty is not, in other words, the natural state is not license. But again, there's no authority over man to determine what is license and what's not license. Okay, in that sense, this is why he wants to say, oh, it's not license. It's not how I'm not really agreeing with Hobbes, but okay, we'll see. Well, let's look at this. Let's look at the line, right? But freedom from men under government is to have standing rules to live by. Okay, now he's quoting. Now, where does the quote of? This is really a pain because this is where the quote he blurs the quote from Filmer, and to this. This is the observation. This is an observation on Aristotle's Politics. This is from Filmer. In other words, the direct quotation from Filmer in the second treatise is from Filmer's observation on not on Aristotle's Politics, and Filmer's not wrong about what Aristotle says there. So, so therefore, there is kind of by him criticizing Filmer, he's in fact criticizing Aristotle. Okay, now let's look at this. Now it says, in other words, and therefore, but the freedom of freedom of nature is to be under no other restraints but the law of nature, and it's not to be, in other words, where rule prescribed not. So even civil society, right? A liberty to follow my own will in all things, where the rule prescribes not, and not to be subject to the inconstant, uncertain, and unknown arbitrary will of another man. Now, on section 23, right? This freedom of absolute arbitrary power is so necessary to and closely joined with a man's preservation that he cannot part with it, but by what forfeits his preservation and life together. For a man not having the power of his own life cannot, by compact or by his own consent, enslave himself to anyone, nor put himself under the absolute arbitrary power of another, to take away his life when he pleases. So, in other words, there's no right, there's no way you can contract or agree to put yourself into the absolute power of someone else. In other words, it's always, and remember that anyone who wants to put themselves power over you is engaging in war in you, and that's the previous chapter, right? That's where the state of war exists. He's saying now here, this is so interesting in this sense, that in other words, cannot by compact or his own consent enslave himself to anyone, or put himself under absolute arbitrary power of another, or take away his life when he pleases, or commit suicide. Okay, wait a minute. There's no right to commit suicide. There's no natural right to commit suicide. Because why? The principal thing is the right to life and the right to self-preservation. Okay? And because of this, because of these things that there's no, there are limits on freedom in a sense. Locke, Locke seems to be making the case for. Okay, and this is interesting in this, and in other words, and therefore this is a challenge to the argument that, and actually this does kind of put a, say, a kibosh on the view that nature has this, the Hobbesian view that in nature man has the freedom to do whatever he wants. This would lead to license, right? The view of license. Locke here seems to suggest that there's a limit because the right of preservation does not give you, limits what you can do. You cannot no one can make himself a slave of another. But wait a minute, but you can consent to give away your power in order to join civil society, right? Join but that's not. He wants to distinguish between absolute arbitrary power and contract by which one is under government. Okay, so there is a distinction between despotic rule. In one sense, he echoes Aristotle. That, in other words, the difference between political rule and mastery, despotic rule. In other words, that political rule and despotic rule are not the same thing. But the difference here is, for Aristotle, the difference was also between um, monarchy. There's that monarchic rule is and political rule are different in kind. Where for Locke, they're the same. Okay, they seem to be combined here, um, and therefore political rule of a magistrate is different from that of a master. Okay, or even a father in this sense. Remember back in chapter 1. So nobody can give more power than he has himself, and that he cannot take away his own life, cannot give another power over it. So therefore, that's very interesting. In other words, you only have as much ability that and since you can't take now, this is a question: is Locke being consistent here, or is Locke kind of a is Locke trying to how there is this sense that Locke is using Christian prejudices, Christian assumptions about suicide is wrong, and and what he's doing is he's making his arguments not. In other words, he's trying to make the argument of the state of nature that it's not the state of nature is not this amoral thing that many Hobbes and many of Hobbes' critics would criticize Hobbes for, right? Um, what Locke does here is try to harmonize a view of natural law with the state of nature. Okay, and that therefore the state of nature is not this war of all against all that Locke that Hobbes clearly makes it by the logic of the system. Locke seems to, at one level, kind of wants to, distance himself. And at the same time, he makes the idea that there's a limit. You have no power. You have no power to give what you don't have, and you don't have the power to kill yourself. But do you? If you're really free, I mean, this is the question. To what degree does he really ever give an argument? If the state of nature is a situation where man has no authority over it, and man himself is the only authority over him is the laws of nature. Well, but wait a minute. Do the law of natures limit what man can do? No, it seems to be the argument is man can do, and therefore this leads to the abuse, because if there would be no crime if nature itself self-corrected wrong behavior, simply enforced it, then there would be no need for politics. Why? Because nature itself, there'd be punishment. There would be an immediate punishment or an immediate correction of error. Okay, but that's not the case. That the law of nature does not have a either a executive authority, no executive power, inherent. In other words, in the state of nature, the executive power is self-help. It's the individual himself, okay, and judicial power is himself. And remember, this was seen as, now he would make a big point, and this is probably the problem. This is the defect of the state of nature that men enter society into to overcome, right? To get to establish a common authority which allows people to settle disputes. Okay, so they don't men are not the judges of their own cases, and that there is and not everyone is left to themselves to enforce the law, to force their rights. So okay, let's go back here. Nobody can is that nobody can give more power than he has himself, and that he cannot take away his own life and cannot give another power over it. Indeed, having by his fault forfeited his own life by some act that deserves death, he to whom he had forfeited it may, when he has him in power, delay to take it and make use of him to his own service. And he does him no injury for it, for for whenever he finds the hardship of his slavery outweigh the value of his life, it is in his power, by resisting the will of his master, to draw on himself the death he desires. Okay. So wait a minute. So therefore, there's no power to do that, but there is a power to do it. Because his argument here is that, well, okay, someone has waged. I'm the criminal, right? The criminal or the one who waged war. Okay, I defeat them. They're now under my power. And instead of killing them, I decide I'm going to make use of them. Okay, I I who have the right to kill them because of what they've done. Instead of killing them, I make use of them. I delay my. I don't execute my pleasure. I delay this. But wait a minute. If I don't kill them, don't they revert back to their condition of being entitled to what you know? Shouldn't I not? If I have not decided to kill him, to take this, what right do I have to exercise absolute power? And what right do they have to accept it? Right? He's just denied it. But then he says right here, they do have the right. So which position is correct? Um, okay, right? And that you have the what? And if you don't like it, the slave can always resist the master and get the death he desires. Right? He says here. Now, 24, this is the condition, this is the perfect condition of slavery, which is nothing else but the state of war continued between a lawful conqueror and a captive. So, therefore, the state of slavery is the state of war still. Okay, and between between a what lawful conqueror and the captive. For once, for if once compact entered between them, and make an agreement for limited power on one side and obedience on the other, the state of war and slavery ceases, for as long as the compact endures. For, as had been said, no man by agreement can pass over to another that which has not him hath himself not okay that which he hath not in himself a power over his own life. So therefore, I can't surrender you my life. I can't surrender you my life. I can't make myself a permanent slave to you. In other words, I can only. In other words, the war ends only either by killing the enemy, or therefore, if I don't kill you, I use you. I'm still kind of in a state of war with you between slave and the master. But then what happens is the only way I can resolve this is by making some agreement, making some kind of contract where once a compact entered between them, and make an arrangement for limited power on one side. In other words, the authority limits the power and obedience. I have to obey this new order. That's the social contract in a sense, right? A social contract has to come in, but it cannot be of absolute power. It must be limited power in that sense. Um, okay, now let's continue the last paragraph here. I confess that I confess we find among the Jews as well as other nations that men did sell themselves, but it is plain this was only to drudgery, not to slavery. So they sold themselves, but this is to drudgery. This is to servitude. That, in other words, service. Um, therefore, there was limits to the slave. In other words, what he means by slavery here is that there's absolute power. That the master has absolute power over the slave. Absolute power, life and death, complete power. In other words, and that and this is that state of war. The second that relationship is limited, then it's not really slavery. It becomes drudgery. It becomes servitude. And he kind of wants to distinguish between drudgery or servitude and slavery in that sense. Slavery is only the condition when one is under absolute authority of another. Once that authority has been limited or constrained by law, that's drudgery. In other words, let's do this. Not slavery, for it is evident the person sold was not under a absolute, arbitrary, and despotist power. For the master could not have the power to kill him at any time, whom at a certain time he was obliged to let go free out of service. And the master of such a servant was so far from having absolute arbitrary power, having an arbitrary power over life, that he could not, at pleasure, so much as maim him, but the loss of an eye or tooth set him free. This is from Exodus. So he's looking at the Exodus account of this. There was limits to what you could sell yourself into bondage for, and there was limits in that sense. The Jewish thing and other people's slavery. And actually, this would be the critique against. In other words, this is the argument against the Marxist or a kind of Marxian view of labor, that the wage laborer is a slave, like a slave. No, there's a contract, and because there's a contract, and the people are free to not do it. But then they say, but they're going to starve if they don't do it. They have no choice. Well, they do have a choice. They can starve. They have a choice to negotiate their better. And one of the things that they can do is not work, and maybe find means to but that's difficult. As that, But in other words, this is the point about this. And a laborer does not. In other words, laboring contracts are under law, and that there's limits to what one can do, even to a servant. So it's not absolute only. In other words, slavery embodies an absolute power over another in law. Okay, now this is where we end. We end with the chapter. If you have any questions or comments, please put them below. I will respond to them when I see them. If you like what we did, please share with a friend. Tell your friends about this. I hope to finish. We're going to be doing these. I'm having some issues with work and things, a little frustration. You can follow me on social media. The information is below. If you want to help me, you want to contribute, you can do so by either Patreon or subscribe to it, or you can buy my books. This book, my current book, actually, I published it. It's my notes to Aristotle's, a notebook on Aristotle's politics, where this is kind of a general reference thing. And it's by Lulu. You buy it by Lulu, I get more money from it. You can buy it Amazon. If I get Amazon, I'll get only a couple dollars. But please do so. Okay, take care and bye bye. See you next. See next time we will be talking the third longest chapter. We'll talk about property. Okay, take care. Bye bye.